Welcome to the Seeker to Seeker podcast. I'm your host Simeon, and I bring you conversations on the spiritual journey with some of the world's most experienced seekers. For writings on spirituality, make sure to check out the Seeker to Seeker blog, linked in the description below. Seeker to Seeker is still getting started, so your support is deeply appreciated. Please consider helping us grow by subscribing to the channel and signing up for the newsletter. Today's guest is spiritual teacher and seeker extraordinaire Thomas Howell, also called Ishtar Ishaya. Ishtar's life has been marked by paranormal experiences from his earliest childhood. Yet everything changed for him when he lost his mother at the age of 13 in a shared car accident. During the event, Ishtar had a striking near-death experience, which put him in what he later learned to be the Samadhi state, which lasted for some weeks before fading. Returning to that powerful state became a consuming desire, which led Ishtar to more and more extreme spiritual and ascetic practices. He went on to spend several years in a monastic setting, after which he became a teacher of consciousness expanding techniques. Ishtar and I covered a wide variety of topics. He shared some of his extraordinary experiences and his profound insights on the spiritual journey. We also discussed politics, psychedelics, reincarnation, and speculated on the purpose of that great mystery we call life. Consider checking out the links in the description to find out more about Ishtar and some of the services he offers in teaching mindfulness practice, astrology, and soul reading. And there's one more thing before we roll. This podcast would not have been possible without the help of a dear friend of both Ishtar and myself, Lee Kedward. Here's a big shout out to Lee, who actually spurred me on to create Seeker to Seeker, and whose continued direction has greatly helped me and others on the journey. Thank you, Lee, for helping me walk the path. Thank you, Ishtar, for the great conversation, and thank you all our viewers and listeners who make all of this worth it. Enjoy. Okay, so would you like to tell me a bit about your experience, just the history of what has brought you to where you are at now, and about some of the experiences you've had, because they really are experiences that very few people have access to. So can you just talk a bit more about that?
Absolutely, and please do just, obviously you're conducting the interview, so please do, come in and steer me around however you see fit.
Yeah.
And I'll try to keep it as short as possible. Well, first I'd like to say, just as a sort of overall kind of just laying an overall sort of framework above everything, that any experiences that I've had, they're open for everybody, and they're also not everything. And a lot of people, me especially when I was a teenager, you read in these books and we didn't have as many videos available in the early days of the internet when I was a teenager, but you get exposure, and sometimes you chase the bells and whistles, shiny kind of experiences. But in the end, liberation is the most mundane thing, and the experiences that drive liberation are so subtle and so grounded. They're as grounded as your next breath. So that's my big caveat that I'm just putting over. I don't think I'm anything special, but here we go. I think consciousness, I think that's a big word that's pretty ill-defined. I think that spirit, soul, consciousness, the higher self, whatever words we want to use for this ineffable something, is knocking constantly at all of our doors, and we just don't notice it. And it just so happened that in my life, for whatever reason, even as far back as when I was sitting in my crib, before I could get out of it, before I could walk and talk, it was there. And so my earliest memories are, basically me sitting in my crib, probably at about 4 or 5 in the morning. I would wait for a long time before my mother would get up and kind of come into the room and check on me. And I remember being breastfed too. That's kind of funny. You're not supposed to remember that. It wasn't my favorite experience in the world. I was really excited when I got the bottle. But anyways, that's an aside. So I would just sit in the crib, and there was this great silence. this great quiet, and I noticed this great quiet. It was a very interesting thing for me. It was almost like a tactile feeling, because in those days a lot of the tactile feelings were what I found very interesting. And only this thing, of course, wasn't necessarily physical. And I would just sit in this sort of field. I would see it around people. I would kind of feel it in my mother. I'd feel it in my sister, in my father, and in my chest of drawers, in everything. And whenever I was, whenever I would find myself getting agitated, often there was, crying or whatever, having a tantrum. There was a certain way in which I would just sort of rest a little bit deeper in that. I'd kind of touch that space. And even though I would kind of keep carrying on, much of the time it was there. So this relationship with this something was a big part of my childhood up until about age 7. And at about age 7, I don't know why I made the decision. Maybe I didn't really make the decision, but I was talking with my mother, and part of it was instigated by my kindergarten parent-teacher conference when I was age 6, and they said, "Oh, little Tommy's got a great personality," and I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. I was like, "Really? Is that so? Okay, that's great." They were, going over all these qualities that adults do when the teacher's trying to tell the parent how their kid's performing in school. And I was just walking with my mom, and she was, I think, on the cusp of going back to school for a counseling psychology master's degree. So a lot of these, and she worked in a psychotherapist's clinic. So a lot of these things were kind of in the air, and she was saying, "Oh yeah, personality," and then sort of describing what it was. And I said, "Oh, okay, well, I think I have to have one of those." And
oh, wow.
I should.
So you grew up with less of a feeling of a self than what is normal, I guess. Less of a connection to an image of who you are. Less or more. Yeah, I remember learning pronouns, and I remember I would go around the house when I was 2, like I think a lot of children do, and I would say mine, 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 but the internal experience of there wasn't this sharply defined feeling of I and thou, even though my words were there. I remember I would walk around the room once I learned, with all the words I was learning, and I would point, I am the shelf, and the shelf is me, and this is, and I would feel myself in all of those objects as if there was this underlying subtle body that connects and links everything. I felt myself in that. So, less or more, who knows? But this is very interesting. This is literally a state people work years towards, through meditation and spiritual practices, to get this kind of non-dual sense of a continuation between this body and this mind and then the exterior world. But then you had it at such an early age.
Yeah, I mean, God knows why. I suspect I was sort of picking up where I left off, or something like that. And the conditions, at least in my little nuclear family home before I went out into the world, weren't really pushing me into too much of I didn't really get that big of a knots of stress in my nervous system. So even as I was learning language and learning pronouns, language was not at all the thing that disrupted this primal unity, and that came later. But yeah, it was there, and it was the most mundane thing, and I thought it really looked very exciting. I think at age 7, a lot of people naturally, that's a period, age 6 and age 7, in which a lot of children really are having to come then into being an individual, and into really starting to develop the ego, and that's natural and healthy. And so that's kind of what happened in my life as well. And I sort of jumped into it. I remember there was a period where I would try on different personalities each day. And by personalities, it was almost, I was also, putting stresses and fears and neuroses without knowing those words. I was sort of inserting those, and I would tell my mother, today, I'm going to like this because I had an experience back then that makes me like it, but I'm going to dislike this. And I kind of would set up my character motivations every day. And this went on for a while. And then at a certain point, some sort of one of the characters just really started to stick. and you know, I had some difficulty in school because I think I was considered quite weird with a lot of my interests, and it was a shock to see how cruel 7-year-olds are to each other, and 8-year-olds. I was thinking, where does this come from? You know, why are people like this so young? And it was heartbreaking, and that's where, you know, that was one of those things where my nervous system started to tighten. We all come up with these different defenses. We try to protect ourselves, and these early life defenses then become habits which often hamstring us as adults. And so that was the cooker for me was elementary school. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I cruised along for a few years, you know, learning how to be an ego, you know, basically, and, you know, learning how to hide different parts of the self that I thought, you know, were disliked, and trying to produce different behaviors that would have people like me. And eventually I think I got pretty good at it, you know, and you know, at playing the game, basically, at wearing masks. And then I was about 13, and you know, all through that period I did have a lot of spiritual experiences, but they were often on the back burner, or you know, I'd let them be up front, but really the goal was to be a well-liked ego. That was what was going on until about, you know, age 13 and after. But
did you recognize these experiences as, which you now call spiritual? Did you recognize them then as spiritual? Did you see them as something different than the mundane world, and something different than what like the other kids were experiencing?
Yeah, to a certain extent. That at first maybe not as much, because I didn't. You know, you tend to accept the world that you're born into. You tend to, you know, you accept the experiences that you have as maybe universal. And so things like seeing ghosts, you know, that you know, quickly dawned on me that was a slightly different thing. You know, also because it didn't seem that my parents had much experience with them, and, you know, some of their friends, and, you know, I kind of figured that out. But these other things that maybe required a more subtle vocabulary to parse out. You know, I didn't have, you know, really good words for them as I was growing up, and I was so concerned with everything else that, you know, they would come and it would just be this wonderful reprieve. But I wasn't clever enough to, you know, in those years to really pursue it, to really sink my teeth into it, and, you know, see where they would take me.
And these experiences that you're talking about, like, included seeing spirits. What other kinds of experiences did you have that now you see were definitely not ordinary?
A lot of precognitive experience. That was another, and of course I was quite skeptical of all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it kind of, you know, probably, you know, just making it up. It's just my imagination. It's cool that I have it, but, you know, I'm not going to hang my hat on it. But I was a big daydreamer, you know, and I was really good in school, so I would often get my work done and have no homework, and sometimes have, you know, a half class period to just do nothing. So it started to happen that my teachers would send me to the library, and sometimes I would just zone out. You know, I'd be looking outside, looking at on a rainy day, and, you know, start to daydream and fall into this beautiful, beautiful silence. And, you know, sometimes that would stay with me for a few class periods, just in the background. And it was very pleasant and soothing and expansive. And out of that state, especially, lots of these sort of precognitive experiences would come. I would have these elaborate, very, very, you know, conversations with people I haven't met yet that weren't really meaningful. And then about, you know, a couple weeks later, here's the new student who's coming to the school, and they're the person I was daydreaming about. Or I find myself in a conversation downtown, going someplace with my sister, and that was the thing that was in my daydream. So I had a lot of that sort of thing. But again, I've thought, well, you know, this is, you know, probably memory is a really unreliable thing, and I'm probably just retroactively, you know, sort of making this up. And then, you know, I'm 13, and I had just broken my arm playing baseball, which was what I was really upset about. I was going to miss the baseball season. So I'm at home with my mother, and then one of these sorts of flashes come that I used to get, only it was much more powerful than the usual precognitive experiences. And only this flash was that my mother was going to die soon. And so that's, that's probably the one that really cemented, okay, you have been this whole time really, seeing things, before they happen. And so I asked her if she was going to die soon. Really my rational part knew that, this kind of a question no one can answer. So, why bother asking? But there was such a force for me to move it out, that I thought, okay, here we are. And she said, of course not for a long time. I'm going to be with you for as long as you need me, stuff that a mother would say. And so I went to bed, somewhat reassured, but then I woke up in the complete opposite state. I sprang out of my bed, breathing quickly and heavily as if I'd just been running a marathon or running from somewhere and running into my physical body. And I sprang up just as my mother and father were walking outside my bedroom door. And I was, had this, I have to tell you guys something, but I can't remember what it was. And I was so distraught that I couldn't remember this thing. And they had to spend about 5 minutes or so kind of, calming me down, because I could be kind of a high strung, child like that. And so they did, and I went off to school, and it was, one of the great days of school because you don't have any homework, and it was 2 days before school was over. So it's supposed to be a really happy day, and get home from school, and we're going to go to the hospital actually to get a cast put on my arm, and dropping my sister off at work, and then boom, we get hit by a car. So this was, this was sort of the fulcrum upon which my life turned. And I just very simply was looking over to my left to talk to my mom. I think I was going to argue for not putting in the Luther Vandross tape. Nothing against Luther Vandross, but I just didn't. I heard it all the time, so I didn't want to hear it that day. And just looking over to my left, here's this giant, just big, like Lincoln Continental or Lincoln Town car, one of those big old wide gray models, and it was less than a second from hitting us. And so we didn't see it because it was behind another car that was going the speed limit, but apparently this one was 20 over. And so just it was one of those bad luck cases where we get hit. And in looking to my left and seeing this car, the first thought that crossed my mind wasn't panic or anything like that. It was, I really thought this one was going to go more than 13 years. It was this kind of, oh, okay, because I was, I guess my first thought was, shit, this is it. And I was pretty certain I wasn't coming out of this one. And so instead of tightening up, there was this wonderful process of loosening and relaxation, and a real sense of diving into this much more expanded strata of awareness, one that I'd been flirting with, or had been flirting with me throughout the previous years of life. And so there it happened that after I thought that question, I went into the classic life review, which I had always been fascinated by, but I didn't think, how could this be possible that you could see your entire life in the flash of an eye, every single event in perfect detail, that had been remembered. But there it went, there it happened, just like going through a movie reel. And only there was sort of a sense of connecting to an omniscient aspect of consciousness that saw everything, that saw every detail, that saw through everything. And so wherever there was a grudge that was held, wherever I had acted out of fear, for instance, wherever I had was wearing a mask for some reason, and any of those situations where there was essentially fighting life in that way, running away, and contracting into a very, very small part of what we could possibly be, was seen and forgiven and released. And it was such a weight that came off, such a sense of weightlessness that occurred with that. And it did feel like, a snakeskin that I had been wearing the whole time was taken off of me. And that, thin membrane seemed to have all of the weight of the world, all of my all of the existential weight that most of us all experience, that I didn't even know I had it on me. I had no idea I was that afraid. I had no idea the degree of the fear that I had been carrying at just 13, with a reasonably easy life, a North American life, for God's sakes. But it was just wait, and it was taken off, and here I was when it was taken off. Everything was this, ineffable silence. Everything was this light. My senses, everything that I saw, was beaming with this light. And this light, the internal, I suppose the subjective experience, was just love and bliss and joy, as if I had been tapping it down my whole life, and I had no idea. And so that was, lasted until I got hit, and then you sort of, you wake up concussed, being sort of pulled out of the car after they saw it open and put in an ambulance, and with this very non-local consciousness that had also been there, but before the impact, this sense of being everywhere and in everything, merged with everything, was still there, even as they're sort of, what's your name? I don't know. How old are you? No idea. That's my mother, though. I do know that. And she called out my name a couple times, and I said twice that I'm okay, Mom. And the second time she clearly registered that, because then her breathing changed from this very labored, struggled breath to a very calm, even kind of a winding down. And I didn't put two and two together in the ambulance, because I felt her. I was out of my body as well, in my body and out of my body. I felt her lifting, because she was just, over, a couple feet from me, on the other side of the ambulance, being worked on by another EMT. But I felt her leaving, and, I didn't realize at the time in the ambulance that this was her death, that this was her leaving the body, until I'm in the hospital, on a gurney in the ER. And then, dad comes in and tells my sister and I, your mother's gone. And so those were, very, very difficult words to hear. And so, had all the grief that one has over months and years. And just at the same time that all of that was going on, that consciousness was also there. And I didn't have words for it. I wasn't raised, in any religious tradition, which was probably helpful. It kept me very open. I had interest in, Tibetan monks and all sorts of Hindu yogis that I'd read about in Time Life books as a kid. But I wasn't making the connections at all between, what I was experiencing and what, these people melting blankets, frozen blankets in the snow were experiencing. It just seemed, why would I make that connection? And so, I thought I was experiencing shock, which I certainly was, but it lasted for 3 months, whatever I was experiencing. And it had these interesting elements of, that spaciousness that was there when I was a child was there again. That there was no fear much in my experience, even if I was having reactions, or, the sort of the emotional reactions you expect from grief, even as I was, from the outside, it would appear to be full on in these things. At the same time, there was a sense of this almost quiet cave that was behind this waterfall of emotion. And this quiet cave, I could fall into it. And when I would do that, out of it would come bliss and joy and, kind of a beautiful, pleasurable sensations that would fill my physical body. So I didn't feel detached or dissociated at all. I felt when I would go into that and let it do its thing, I felt more connected to everybody. I could feel into everybody. I could feel the sorrow and the fear that, and until the car accident, I had been doing my best to control, just like, I would see everybody else. And so I realized, oh my God, wow, what pain. What struggle we go through unnecessarily. Wow. And, so there were a lot of moments like that, realizations of the contrast between what I was experiencing then and what others were experiencing and what I had been living before for, 7 of those 13, years before the accident. So it was a very interesting phase. It didn't last forever. For whatever reason, when going back to 8th grade, the seeds of trying to, be a person basically were there. And so I tried to resurrect my old life as best as I could. I tried to kind of carry on with the goals and ambitions that seemed to have been propelling. I wanted to sort of be a good son and a good brother and a good grandson and all these other things, and be a high achiever and do all this stuff. But in a certain way, it was just a sham I was putting myself through, and so it took me about 5 years from that to then finding myself in an ashram, monastery on the West Coast, because after 1 year of school, it was the summer, and I walked into a bookstore, metaphysical bookstore, with my sister. I'd never been into one before. I never wanted to go into a metaphysical bookstore before in my life, but we went in, and I went into the back room where all the books were, and opened up a book at random, and there were descriptions of these experiences, cultivated by Himalayan yogis, which sounded very, very similar to what I'd been experiencing, and that was it.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
So this is very interesting to me, because usually the process is, you read about these experiences and gradually you become convinced that they're possible, and then you start practicing, and then you start to see them happening gradually, blooming in you, this capacity for spiritual experience. But with you actually had the most powerful spiritual experiences you can imagine. You didn't have the vocabulary to put them into any conceptual system, and then you discovered them in the books and kind of started making sense of what you had already experienced, which is amazing. Yeah. Like
I had to,
Yeah, like Satori experiences, the experience of non-duality. You had this idea of being in the world but not of it. All these things that mystics have spoken about for thousands of years. You had them before even being acquainted with them. Yeah.
And then, I had this burning desire to work my way back, because when the experiences faded, boy, it was just then an internal shit show, a real unmitigated, real proper suffering, and trying to be a little self with all that grief and everything else that was going on was just hard. I had been lucky, and I had no idea how easy all that silence and joy and lack of fear had actually made life. It was so easy, and then it was so difficult. And so I really wanted to get back. I had no idea how to get back. So I started to do it logically. I said, well, clearly, my life was put in danger. So that must be the main mechanism that can, unlock this experience. That was my thing. So I'm going to have to start jumping out of cars. That was somehow, the teenage mind, right? It's like, and so I did. I started, golf carts, jumping off retaining walls. But I was careful about it. I was kind of ramping up because I didn't want to break bones. I was like, we should be measured in this approach. But I was trying stuff, without knowing a direction to it. And so I'm very thankful that I walked into that bookstore, because that that gave me much safer an idea of more safe and reliable means of approach. And so, I had some wonderful people I was already surrounded by wonderful people, truly. My sister and my father were, very good people to have around.
And how much did they know and understand about your experiences? The extraordinary experiences, and how did they manage to support you in that?
Well, my sister more so than my father, both because I told her more things, and I think she had the wherewithal to intuit a whole lot more, because in some ways she knew me better. She was my big sister, and I was kind of often attached at the hip, as a kid, I liked to follow her around and hang out with her her and her cool friends, and she welcomed that, which was cool, and she helped me a lot. My dad, was really, I could tell, he was really struggling because, my mom died, his wife died, and they'd been together a long time, and it was just devastating for him. So I could, I didn't want to tax his what seemed to be already taxed reserves. But then with my sister, that said, I always, even though she's probably one of the people I trusted the most in the world, I didn't tell many people a whole lot of stuff, actually. I still had this sort of tendency of keeping a lot of things close to the chest, or wanting to kind of, work things out on my own, and kind of get a handle on things before, sort of sharing them. So, only a certain amount. And
Yeah.
I didn't have great vocabulary either for what was going on. I really, really had difficulties putting any of this sort of experiencing into words that effectively communicated much of anything. So when I, after a few ham-fisted attempts, I would just be like, oh, fuck it. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know how to describe this thing that's happening.
Yeah, and also I think there's something to be said about not really kind of sharing all of these mystical spiritual experiences. Like, traditions you have either, don't throw pearls to the swine, or in Buddhism, not sharing the kind of highest, most advanced techniques. And at first you hear this and you think, oh, those are just, arrogant practitioners who don't want to share what they've learned. But actually, even if you are just beginning to practice, you see that it's not beneficial neither to you nor to other people to kind of share some of the things, because it both can devalue them, it can also distort them in your own mind, and really they must be experienced rather than talked about sometimes.
I think there's a lot to be said about that. I wouldn't make it a hard and fast rule, but I think there's a lot to be said for taking things slowly, and this sort of what, get really diving and getting to know the depths a little bit more, before talking all the time about everything. But it was certainly when the things faded, after a few months, it was certainly a big forgetting still. So I'd kind of given myself this very concentrated preview, which some of me still connected with, and then I had to really kind of find my way back. In some ways, almost like at square one again. Not really square one, but similar. And so there was this process of having different people come into town who served as spiritual mentors. I was mainly drawn to them because they sort of exuded or gave off, to a certain degree, the flavor of what I'd experienced. And so I was drawn to that, like a tuning fork. And I couldn't, didn't have the words to put onto it yet. But there was something there. And so it took all my high school years basically to kind of sort of find my way to what was really trying to emerge in my life, because I was resistant to it as well. I was even afraid to meditate, even though there was such a draw to do that intuitively. The draw was coming from kind of a deep and intense and somewhat unsettling space, because I still had it in my mind that my life needed to go like this, that I needed to, everything that I'm doing now, I should be prepping to get into the best sort of college or university and, sort of achieve a certain amount of financial success and security and all these things that I was kind of brought up to, want to pursue. And so this deep spiritual desire in me felt like a crazy monk who was going to set everything on fire. And so it took me a while until, in fact, which was kind of what turned out to be the case, but it took a while for me to kind of just decide to go with that. And thankfully that's what happened.
And you really did go with this. I think another thing that really kind of fascinates me with your story is that you had all of these experiences, but then you didn't kind of rest on them or rely on them. You actually start pursuing like all of these practices, for example, meditation. And the way I've heard you speak about this, like you were brutal with your approach to meditation and to all of these like fasting and all of these practices. So can you talk just a bit about this, because I'm very interested in kind of the drive you had in pursuing all these practices.
Yeah, well, it was a hodgepodge for me approach. It was, I'm going to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, but including the kitchen sink at this thing, because I didn't really have like a teacher or a main teaching at the time. I had mentors, but they were, I think, to their credit, very light with me, very light with the young fellow. And so, some of them taught me some practices, some qigong and breathing meditation, energy work type stuff, things of that nature. Some of it a little bit more peripheral. And then I came across this book, which I don't recommend at all, actually. This book called the Lost Teachings and the Children of the Law of One, or something of Atlantis, the Lost Teachings of Atlantis and the Children of the Law of One. I really don't recommend it. But the exercise, I kind of used it as almost like a bit of Bible. And because they had a regimen, they had a regimen of different meditations, and so I just decided, fuck it, I'm going to do this exactly as they say, 4 to 6 hours a day with cold showers, and throw this in here, and I'm gonna see what this is like, because I always had a streak in me which was unsatisfied with half measures. There was always, this is just a personal bias of my psyche, but there was always this sort of drive that if you're going to do something, you might as well do it. Otherwise, how do you know that you've actually done it? Do it fully. Otherwise, what are you doing? And so, yeah, I went celibate. I, basically broke up a really good relationship.
That's dedication.
Yeah, which is crazy, because when you're 17, you're really keen on all that sort of stuff, especially. But I had to do it, and so yeah, I started I was a night person, like a lot of teens are, and I said, well, I'm going to go to bed at 9 p.m. and get up at 3 a.m. and I'm going to take these cold showers, and then I'm going to meditate for 2 to 3 hours, and
wow.
And then I added like running 8 miles into the regimen, and then I added fasting, and of course the rule for me at the time was, if you're good, everything I overdid. So even so, there was a certain amount of stress load going into the nervous system, but at the same time, things were happening. Things. I don't think the meditations were all that great technique-wise, but I was starting to experience the silence again. And usually for me in short little morsels. After basically almost tiring myself out in a certain sense, but there it would be, and that's what I was living for. It was like a lot of work for a little payout, but at the time the payout seemed great. And so that was that. And, thank God Yogananda's autobiography came into my life. And, I read that book, and that first opened me to the fact that, the spiritual traditions are vast and varied and many, and are in this world today, and that meditation could be easy and blissful, that there was food for the heart that was accessible. I would just read the book and feel my whole being be opened up by Yogananda's kind of flavor that really comes through that book. And feeling the silence not just be this, sort of thing behind me, but this thing that was filling me up often. And so I remember getting to a point in the book where he said, anybody who prays to Babaji, earnestly will be heard. And, I wasn't a big believer in prayer or anything like that at the time, but I said, okay, I'm going to take you up on this, Yogananda. It can't hurt. So I started praying to Babaji to help me find my path. I didn't know, I knew that I wanted to go to a monastery or an ashram. That was a very clear sort of thing in my mind, but I just didn't know where. So I was getting brochures for different traditions mailed to me, and reading through them and just sort of trying to feel them out. And none of them were quite. There was a certain resonance that I knew I was kind of searching for, and none of them quite had it. And then my sister and I started the Lake Geneva Metaphysical Society. That was the town that I grew up in, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And one of the first person that came to us to invite was turned out to be my first brother-in-law, and he did this practice called the Ishaya's Ascension, and I'd never really heard of it, although actually I had encountered it, but just sort of dismissed it very quickly a couple times before.
And what kind of practice is it?
It's an effortless practice first. It's kind of a mantra practice, only you're primarily not using Sanskrit mantras, which caught me off guard, because at the time I think I was a Sanskrit chauvinist in my thinking, saying this is the sacred language, we must use this, and so it uses these short, English for me because that's my first language, but these short phrases that incorporate praise, gratitude, love into their structure. Then they're kind of like little short prayer mantras, really. And such a practice did not appeal to my biases, when thinking about it. But he invited me to this weekend, and he even paid for my class. He told me that the money magically showed up in his account. Probably that was a fib to try to get me, to lure me out of my routine. But I found myself saying yes in such a way. It was as if when I came home, my prayers seemed to clearly being answered. There was such a massive yes that came out of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And so I went to the class, and I was kind of blown away by the ease at which I was getting into this space, which previously had been taking me so much effort to fall into. And there I was. And so I thought, okay, well, it makes no sense to me why this should be working, unless it's exactly why they say it does, that somehow these are thoughts from the mind of God or something like that. Who knows? Just like Sanskrit mantras. So I'm going to try this out and see if this lasts, and see if this is something I ought to be doing for years and years. And it turned out that it was. And then it turned out that they had various, at the time, 2 or 3 sort of ashram type setups that I eventually got myself an interview with one of them on the Oregon coast after many phone calls. and was an interview which I was just going, I made it up in my mind before going that if they said no, I was going to camp out and have to be removed by the police, because I figured that there'd be this sort of Shangri-La type test of my dedication.
Yeah.
Oh, this is probably endemic to all spiritual paths. They're going to abuse you and probably hit you, and you just have to show them that so that was how I was prepared for it. It was much easier than that. I mean, I came in and there was a bed that was made up with a little towel on it, and this is quite new in my experience. This sort of I don't know, friendliness.
Yeah, and so you were eventually led into the path of meditation, and you practiced for years, correct? Well, you're still practicing. So eventually you did find the tool that helped you get back to these states in meditation, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about your experience with meditation, what you've discovered to work and not to work in meditation, and what you would advise people who are interested in meditation or already practicing about how they can further their practice?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, first, I can't be too dogmatic on this, because I am definitely a believer in different strokes for different folks, and that included in that different practices might work better for a particular individual at different times in their life, even. So I'm pretty wide open to a whole bunch of things, or no things at all working for someone. Although practically, I think having a methodology and having competent reflection and competent guidance for most of us really sort of shortens the journey considerably. For me, and I think for many out there, more effortless practice is probably much superior to the kind of crazy shit I was putting myself through. And what I was putting through isn't even crazy by, say, Kumbh Mela standards. You know, wasn't raising a hand up for 20 years or something like some people do. Show up at the Kumbh Melas and was, you know, burying myself in the sand and lighting 4 fires around my head, and, you know, it didn't go that far. And yet at the same time, I think I was going, you know, too far with the ascetic stuff and with the efforting and with, you know, developing concentration. There's this thought across many spiritual disciplines, whether it's Christian or you know, Hindu or Buddhist or whatever, that there's a sense that the monkey mind has to be tamed in a certain way, and often has to be tamed through force. And, you know, furthermore connected to that, there's a sense that we have to sort of remove a lot of our flaws before we're able to enter the gates of paradise, to put it poetically. But, you know, that we have to work on ourselves before even getting access to Samadhi. And I think that is the complete opposite. So I did spend a lot of time trying to become a better person and trying to, you know, I even had a little book I'd write my faults in. And then I had like little lines where I'd put a check mark when I committed one of them, like I was some sort of ego traffic cop of myself. And I'd have virtues that I was supposed to develop. And I was trying to, you know, I thought, oh, it makes sense what these books are telling me, that you have to, you know, work on these things before progressing to another level. And really what I found is that Samadhi is endemic, that falling into that space is natural, and that a really good methodology or technique, say, I do like mantra practice when used effortlessly, in that it's the sense is that you are feeding that monkey an ideal banana. So you're not trying to chain it up. You don't need to chain it up. You can give it something that it enjoys, and that truthfully what the mind, what the psyche really wants is that space. You know, it doesn't complain when we're in that space, when we fall into it in a peak experience. You know, you're there, you love it. All of you loves that. And so we just need to have kind of an effective ideal banana to sort of guide the mind, you know, back into, oh yeah, okay, that's right. I like this much more than all these neuroses. You know, I like this much more than all these patterns. And so if we do that enough, if we use these ideal bananas enough, sooner or later we start to develop a habit for that. You know, it builds up a positive feedback loop. It forms, instead of being in the vicious cycles that we all know, you know, when we get reactive and we, you know, get even more tangled up, we can also form virtuous circles. And so that's what I suggest is getting tuned into some kind of effortless practice where instead of chaining the dog by the back door and it wants to then bite you when you let it off the chain, you feed it, and then it becomes your best friend and it looks out for you.
Yeah, this reminds me of, there's this idea essentially that as long as you define yourself as a seeker, as long as you keep on working on yourself, you don't live. So that's, let's say, Meister Eckhart says, so far as you are in yourself, there's no space for God to enter in. So his recommendation is, you know, to empty yourself of yourself to make space for God. So essentially stop chasing self-improvement, because it's yourself that's kind of in your way to improvement.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really cool idea.
And we sort of achieve stop chasing, because it actually that we get into a double bind right there. You tell anybody stop thinking, stop chasing, you know, it doesn't really work, you know, that well. Like, I'm gonna not be a seeker, I'm gonna stop seeking, and you know, then it just becomes another layer. So it's much easier to fall into the thing that you're seeking. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like simplistically childlike to say that, I know, to many, but it's kind of how it is. You fall in, you get a taste of the pudding. It's there. You fall into it. And when you taste the pudding, you don't, at that level, you don't have to think, oh, I'm not going to be a seeker anymore, because you're eating the damn stuff. And so, you know, all those things fall away. It's like, you know, I remember, you know, you could have told, I was told 1,000,000 times or 1,000 times by peers, you know, like, don't have a carrot, you know, don't have these projections of what it's supposed to look like in front of you, or don't chase this thing. But, you know, we're naturally going to chase things. And that's what our mind does. And so instead of, holding my mind back from chasing something, the process involved using these methodologies to take me and give me the experience of what I was chasing again and again and again, until that experience became the baseline, until that started to fill up the being.
And what do you think about the idea of sometimes we get into these spiritual states, but then it is possible that sometimes we fall into attachment with the states themselves. And then, so for example, to give a personal example, often when I meditate, sometimes, I would be kind of graced with this experience of non-duality and oneness and all of that. And then the next day I meditate and it's not there. And then I feel that I've done something wrong. And then I have to meditate more. And, it's again falling into attachment, only it's not a material attachment, but it's a spiritual attachment. And again, I think that's a hindrance to the path, I think. So what do you think about this?
Well, I mean, I like to sort of restate instead of we're not actually attached to the state itself there. We're attached to our idea that we were in the state, just like anything else. Like if you had really good sex and now you think, well, I'm not having good sex anymore. It's not like you're attached to the sex, you're attached to this memory and which is sort of tied into this underlying sense that right now, this moment there's something wrong. A lot of it breaks down to that. Truth be told, is this often inchoate, subtle sense of just being less than, of judgment, of the present moment of self. And so yeah, that's having those carrots. That's just another, one of the, in some ways, kind of natural, unnatural, ways of the mind. And so you can't stop yourself from thinking those thoughts. It doesn't necessarily work to just say, no, I'm not going to think that thought like that. It's going to move. It's going to think itself in a certain degree. So it's better to just, don't follow it, and then, continue with your meditation, continue practicing. And then it's as if, that tendency dies down, because that's, a lot of those thoughts ultimately, they are built in this sort of very subtle master thought. There are kind of certain keystones to the whole structure of the ego, truth be told, or they're keystones to the sense of being separate. And so as those keystones start to relax and dissolve, as those roots start to relax and dissolve, then the whole structure starts to topple, and we're not really bothered by that anymore.
So kind of the approach that you take is not fighting against the ego and everything that issues from it, but kind of going with the flow and going with it. This kind of reminds me of the Eastern thing, the whole thing about yin and yang, and incorporating both of them and not kind of suppressing one, because of the other. Like, for example, Jung would speak very often, he would write about how the path to enlightenment, or what he called individuation, is kind of developing the wholeness of a person. So it's not kind of choosing a number of things and saying, like, this is what I'm going to be. I'm just going to be a very happy, peaceful person who never gets angry, and but incorporating the whole personality and kind of finding the right place for everything. So what do you think about this? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'd say that maybe I have to say that there's wholeness that's already here. There's a layer of wholeness that, we could call it samadhi, the experience of that wholeness, samadhi or turiya or satori or whatever the hell we want to use for it, the peace that passes all understanding. And so we don't have to have an oppositional relationship with, our sense of being separate from that wholeness to achieve that wholeness. In fact, that has a tendency of keeping us more enmeshed in that structure more than anything else. We don't have to follow thoughts. You can come and say, like, nope, we're gonna, if you have the wherewithal, we're not gonna go down that vicious circle, and that's good. That's intelligent. But that tends to be more and more effective to the degree that we are actually falling into and experiencing that wholeness which is already there. So yeah, the best way to get away or transcend or not get caught up in that whole big net is not to fight it, but is to go underneath it, to touch that. And when we touch that wholeness, there is this natural tendency for the whole plant of fragmentation to be uprooted and to be dissipated as if it was, a dream the whole time, because it was.
So then how do you approach this? Is it simply, so for example, how do you incorporate formal practice into this, approach of kind of seeing the wholeness that's already there? For example, in your practice, in your daily life and with your students, do you recommend daily practice, or let's say practicing only when you feel like it? How do you go about it?
Daily. Yeah. I mean, it depends on where somebody is sort of at, how much they know, but typically, daily, to kind of, we're sort of cutting out and ceasing some really old bad habits that we've developed. We've developed habits of tensing ourselves into this very small framework of identification, which sort of feeds itself. And so to get around that habit, we have to develop new habits of relaxing into being itself, of touching that space. So yeah, 2 or 3 times a day, with, at least in my modality, 2 or 3 times a day with the practice for as long as you can muster. And then I have an eyes open practice with that as well. To be done loosely, not in a dissociative sort of way, but to be as an adjunct. And so, the analogy that we use, which is, straight out of the TM, Transcendental Meditation world, is this is a process that's kind of like dyeing a cloth. And, you take a cloth, you put it in the dye, take it out. At first, the color is very bold, but when it dries in the sun, or, the sun in this case being everyday experience, the color fades a little bit, because, we haven't freed ourselves, fully from that structure in just one meditation, unless we do, but most people not. And so that we just kind of keep putting the cloth back into that dye, and then gradually over time, the color of the cloth and the dye becomes indistinguishable, or nearly indistinguishable. And this is to kind of crib Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. He was one time asked if I think the guy had a southern accent. Maharishi, is enlightenment a gradual thing, or is it a sudden shift? And then he said, it is a gradual shift, with a smile. And so that's exactly, it's a gradual shift. We are basically coming awake to something that's already awake. We're refamiliarizing ourselves with something that's been there the whole time, that we've simply been ignoring because we're busy in so many ways, upholding this maladaptive structure, upholding this maladaptive set of existential tensions.
Yeah.
So.
But also it's very interesting. Recently, I've realized how that there's really a problem with the way we use enlightenment a lot of the time, because we just say Jesus Christ was enlightened, and then Gandhi was enlightened, and then you see a person who said, I don't need any more meditation, I'm perfect as I am, he's enlightened. And then you go to a Buddhist monk who literally seems like a different kind of species, and you say they're enlightened. And then we use the same word for so many different states. And I think that this often becomes a problem, because then we can't differentiate between, this state and that state. So yeah. Ultimately, what do you think about the idea of enlightenment and of calling a person enlightened?
Oh yeah, sometimes I don't want to use the word at all, because it is so it's ill-defined, and it's there are so many definitions going about for it. Rather, I think it's on the individual level, it's good to be very honest about what we're experiencing, and to sort of have the ability to take off whatever concepts that we have, and as much as we can, just be very get down to the brass tacks of I'm feeling afraid, I'm feeling tense, whoa, there's this vast expansiveness here, or whatever our experience happens to be, and just sort of, not have these big carrots on top of these big words, covering everything. And, that's, first of all, what's good. Second of all, I do think that people who have the wherewithal, at least, and it's maybe their purpose in life, should, create more careful maps for people to, sort of be guided by. And there are no perfect maps. So, I kind of came up from that TM world. And for instance, they have this sort of 7 states of consciousness plus additional kind of framework, in which we have waking, sleeping, dreaming. Then your gateway into the rest of the world is Samadhi, which is kind of considered the neutral gear that underlies all of these states. And once Samadhi is stabilized, then we have the first degree of enlightenment, and then we have another stage after that, and we have unity consciousness, and other things. And all of these states kind of have with them certain experiences that become more and more permanent. So they're describing kind of experiential plateaus which are stable and ongoing. And so it is good, for instance, like say with the word awakening, which is it's just as bad as enlightenment. The main mistake that most of us make is that we have a taster experience, and then we consider it to be somehow, I don't know, like a final sort of state. And so that's the main, I suppose, error that covers most of our mistakes, is just mistaking something that's temporary for something else that we haven't quite stepped into and tasted yet. And if people just sort of had that little bit down, it saves us an awful lot of trouble on the path to just, and not even thinking about it, even though it's a natural gimmick of the mind to be chasing these states, like a rabid dog, trying to go for this thing, and the mind is going to produce a lot of noise, but until it doesn't anymore. And I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree with you. And also I'm curious, because with meditation, it's a gradual shift, as you said, towards, whatever it leads to. But then with you've already started with a very special mind, or whatever it is that gives you these experiences that you have. And so I was thinking, how has your particular psyche reacted to meditation? So for example, has this increased or in any way changed your, what some people would call paranormal experiences? Has it fed them? Has it quieted them down? Do you still experience these like extraordinary perceptions?
Well, there was I think it happened in both at different times. There was a period when I was about 18, 19, 20, 21. And I think at that time it was really, really important for me to just be focusing on, the unmanifest silence. And that to just really kind of get that grounded in and ground into that, and get as much exposure to that as possible. And without me trying to do that or anything, it just seemed that a lot of those faculties just kind of that I had maybe when I was younger sort of subsided a little bit. And I didn't make that happen. It just seemed to kind of maybe happen by, grace, or, some higher aspect of self sort of looking out for the young seeker. And then a certain period came, maybe a couple of years after that, in which there was this explosion of those sorts of abilities kind of were starting to then predominate again, but in a very different way. And so I think in a certain sense, some of the old subtle body, or I don't know how to say this, psychic structures that they were built on really needed some deep renovation and cleaning. And so for a period, everything was just sort of taken back to the shop to get a nice, rebuild. And then at a certain point, there was this flowering of these other dimensions of experience in that. And so then, yeah, it came back, and And then, I kind of had a bit of a dark night of the soul, I suppose. I don't want to misuse that word too much. Maybe I'll misuse it only a little. and where I was at university, and so everything kind of, shut down again. But then after coming out of that, about age 29, again, there was this big explosion of those sorts of abilities. But they were again also sort of couched in a very different context, of awareness. So whereas before, sometimes, I don't know, a precognitive experience or a past life memory or, seeing some weird sort of stuff would have in some ways, maybe more of an intense or bells and whistle type quality to the experience. Later on, it just almost felt as normal as me looking at the toaster over there, or, kind of, past life memories, which I'm still skeptical of, but things that I'd be, very tempted to call past life memories in the last 3 years, they have felt just like memories of my own childhood in a certain sense. They've had this sort of very mundane, normal and regular quality to them. And sometimes I've only noticed that this particular life because I'm like, yeah, I don't recall playing a 17th century piano instrument in this life. Some difference strikes me, and I'm like, oh, okay. I don't recall being a farmer in East Anglia, using this type of pitchfork in this particular life. So they're that normal, they're that mundane that I could miss them, just like any other memory.
That's actually really interesting that you touched upon this, because I think the question whether we live multiple lives or not is kind of relevant to all of us, literally. And then you've had access to experiences that many of us haven't. So what have your experiences kind of, how have they informed you on this? Where do you stand on the question of whether we do reincarnate and how that works, if it does?
Well, first of all, that is absolutely what I think is going on. Second of all, experientially, and this, I don't want to split hairs here really, because it's not that important, but my experience, say in the past 3 or 4 years, which is when there's been a very big flowering of all these sorts of things, has been sometimes that they're all happening right now, and that my access to all of these other lives has basically come about simply because of the practice of centering myself more and more and more into this sort of now, eternal now space. It's almost as if the now is this great center of gravity, and that the more that you stay there, the more of your total experience is sort of pulled in. And so in that sense, I've at the same time, the more everything's pulled in, you could say the more you're living non-locally too. I mean, we could describe it spatially both ways, but there's a sense of me sometimes living a couple places at the same time. I'm not saying this doesn't have to develop for people, but August of 2017 was a crazy month. I don't know why that month in particular played out the way it did, but I would be living my regular life in Portland, Oregon, doing my jobs, teaching meditation or building houses or planting gardens or driving around to give talks on NDEs or whatever. And that was clearly there, but at the same time, it was almost as if someone took a thin film on top, and I would find myself being in 2nd century BC Republican Rome. It was so arresting. I would be literally having conversations with, the guy down at the convenience store 2 blocks from my house, and he's in a fucking toga, and we're having another conversation, and somehow at the same time, and somehow, my consciousness is tracking both of these and is having some sort of very trans-rational understanding that there is some kind of connection or resonance between these 2 lives and all the experiences therein. At the same time, I would sometimes have a third lifetime happening, which seemed to be 15th century Tuscany. So two Italian things, God no. And I would pass by this retaining wall to the highway that I would pass a lot in Portland. And previous to that, I would often experience very strong emotions when I would go by this thing that were inexplicable. During this August 2017 month, for instance, those emotions became so intense, I would start crying. I would at different spots due to the visual, and I allowed it to sort of the emotion to really play through. And then there was this realization that somehow it was important for me to be in Portland, Oregon for almost like finishing off loose ends, basically. I had the open question to myself, why am I in this town? Because in some ways it wasn't a great fit for me. And I guess that question was being answered in all of these interactions. So there was this sense of, also I would have the sense of being in meditation in this life and having it ripple out and affecting me in these other bodies at the same time. That was a weird experience too. I would had this, these other experiences, since then, for instance, where like one day I was sitting down at a client's house and sort of potting some plants, because what's one of my lines of work was as a permaculture gardener. And, in the moment of sitting down, I always sit down I didn't notice it, but I often sit down in a very particular manner in which when I'm sitting down, my hands are like this. And then I caught myself just in that moment. I was sitting down like that and said, oh, that's peculiar. And as soon as I thought that was peculiar, I found myself, instead of on this beautiful back deck with all these plants around, I was visually and sensorily in what looked like some kind of early 18th or late 17th century beautiful interior space with beautiful wood paneling, sort of corbelled ceilings, and I was sitting down at a piano, and I could see what my sleeves looked like. I was looking down at my sort of buckled shoes with stockings coming up on these pants, and a beautiful sort of early piano forte. And the room was like a hush, but it was the kind of hush where I could feel all these people behind me, and I was sitting at a piano. And I could smell the wood, I could smell the oils that were used on the piano and on the ceiling and on the walls, and I could see feel the light of this really big candelabra, which was, kind of near the piano, so I could, and it was the most evocative experience. So I've had a lot of those types of things, and it's just almost like wandering into another spoke of a wheel. And I use that example a lot. I wish I had a piece of paper available, but my feeling is that this particular incarnation is like one spoke of many, of a wheel. And that the more most of the time we live our lives kind of on the surface of the wheel. And so we know very little about the spoke that we're on right now. We don't live it out in much of a full manner, but meditation is touching the center of the wheel, the infinite center, really. Consciousness, total consciousness. And the more we touch that, and we, instead of starting to live at the surface, we start to live close to the center. And so the more we touch the center, at some point it may happen that we start to experience all these other spokes, whether they're previous incarnations or whether whether we're simply living through many nervous systems, because we're all at core, the infinite one consciousness. I leave that up to debate, or whether it's both. I think it's probably both. But I found myself, waltzing or wandering accidentally into these other spokes that are on this wheel, and sometimes, having the experience of a few at the same time. And I do think it's about learning.
Mm-hmm. I literally have so many questions after what you've just told me. It's difficult to know where to begin. But for example, so the understanding that you currently have is that these past lives, and also it's a question, are they only past lives, or do you also see things that are like lives that are about to happen? And if you do, you understand that they're all occurring in some sense, in some scale of reference at the same time. And then do you
Yeah.
think that when you experience those other lives, they experience you? Do you know if this happens as well?
Yeah, I think so. I do think so. It's getting into some fun science fiction-y type territory, but I suppose on a timeline, I think I have waltzed and connected to things that on our current timeline haven't happened yet, things that are in the future. But I'm really experiencing all these, at least my access to these things. I think other people might have different means of accessing this sort of thing, but at least my access is, predicated upon diving into this timeless space which encompasses all of them, which is giving rise to all of them at once. And so I do, sometimes I have felt people on other parts of the timeline, maybe they're much more spiritually advanced than me, or it doesn't really matter, but I feel them affecting this life in very positive ways. It's almost as if I feel it feels as if somebody who did something right, or let go of something in a profound sort of way, has also affected this life. Alternatively, I've felt this life rippling out into other ones. There have been times where something has fallen off in this life, because of meditation, or because of just making that subtle but very meaningful shift, and it has lightened the load of another one of these lives. I could put it that way. Ultimately, the main feeling is that this is just a game of returning to a wholeness that's already there. All of these mushrooms on the surface are all tied to the same mycelium, and it's possible for all of these different lives to return to this wholeness, to this firm consciousness of this thing that's underlying them all. And so I have often felt almost, you could say, like as if I've pulled some of these lives into me in a certain sense, not to this particular body, so to speak, but there's a sense that we're all trying to get back to the same wholeness at the end of the day. That's what everything is about. That if we're talking about framing having different lives as a means of achieving some sort of lesson, as some that's what it is. The lesson isn't all these sub lessons about being a better person or something like that. The lesson, it isn't necessarily about improvements. It's about just coming back home, just coming back to the home that's there, that's been there all the time. So that's the feeling.
And do you think that there are particular, let's say you're one soul, let's call it in this way, a certain node, a certain central focal point which connects basically on the wheel, which connects all of these different lives? Do you think that you on the deepest level are a personality that has all of these different aspects, and that there are other personalities which have other lives? Or do you essentially believe that all lives, currently mine now, is an aspect of yours in the same way that you would be an aspect of my own?
That depends. Yes to actually all of them. To answer it like that for you, but I also look at it like I use a tree analogy to explain this. Like you've got the trunk, central trunk, which unites all of the branches, and the branches branch off into their own branches, and they branch off into leaves, and so I think of the spiritual journey as essentially a journey from leaf all the way down to trunk. And so we, this is the leaf shape right here. This is leaf, and you've got your leaf over there. Whatever we want to call it, a branch. But as we're walking back, we are sort of, we're also like Russian dolls in that sense too. This is maybe the smallest possible doll, or largest if we're using the smallest as in our analogy as transcendent. But as we're all walking back to one point, and so as we go back toward that one point, our expression, our individual expression, is larger and larger and larger, and then at the same time encompasses, you might say, more sub-individuals. And that's kind of the way it feels. For instance, in our tradition, we would have this thing of getting Sanskrit names or a spiritual name. The spiritual name, say it's supposed to be a representation and sound of your pure essence, pure suchness, then people have gotten different names. Like people haven't just had one name, because it was as if they had more expansive names that were going back beyond, say, the first name that they got. And that's a representation of the fact that at different levels were different sizes. I also work as an astrologer, which is a kind of funny thing for me to be into, but astrology is a language of archetypes. And although I'm going way beyond how Jung was talking about archetypes here, just to be clear, it's a language of archetypes or platonic forms. And, all of us have these platonic form levels to us. It's like, sometimes I see people and I see archangels basically walking, sort of playing human basically. And what I mean by that is that, I'll see maybe the largest possible facet, of this person. I think we're all facets of the God diamond, if you want to use those words. That's our purpose here is to kind of continue expanding into multiplicity and then coming back of that singular entity. When we use the word God, we could say, well, if you could put a form on the formless, right? If you could put boundaries on the bounded, we would call the first form, we could call it God or goddess or love or something very broad and expansive like that. And so we're all just sort of these points at the end of this very, very broad face.
So this actually reminds me of the first guest I had, Chris Beige, who he had many and very intense psychedelic experiences. And at some point he would see this dimension, or let's say level of reality, which he would call the archetypal. And just like you, he said that this didn't exactly correspond to either Plato's or Jung's idea of archetypes. It was different. It did incorporate their ideas, but it was different. And then very interesting, he said that he had the strong sense that we as people are not really living, but it is these archetypes that are really possessing this life, and they live through us in a sense. So is this what you kind of mean or see as well?
Yeah, I could mean that at a certain level. Yeah, I mean, language is a funny thing, but absolutely, a big experience is you could say, if we use the ocean, wave ocean analogy, right? There's a sense that, most of us walk around thinking we're these little waves and it sucks, or it's good and it still sucks. But we walk around like that. But, part of the journey of meditation is becoming progressively more ocean-like, and so at a certain point, very just naturally, instead of saying, well, I'm a wave experiencing the ocean, there's a sense of being the ocean living through a wave. And that's another way of saying what Chris Bash was talking about. There's, we could step down the ocean a little bit to maybe like a big part of the ocean would be an archetype, and this analogy would say, oh, it's just, a big center. That's kind of a step down of the totality is an archetypal facet. But yeah, it does, all the world's a stage. That is what it seems like. It's a stage of all these different archetypes living as sort of sub-archetypes, dancing around and either dancing with some pain because we only know ourselves as the character that we're playing, or dancing with some ease and joy because we also know that we're the totality. And funnily enough, when we know that we're the totality, when there's that direct experience of relaxing into that vastness that's in there, then we become much more, I suppose, unique, expressions, because funnily enough, we're more freed up, and so it's like that as well. We don't become bland vanilla.
And these things that you're talking about, which you have experienced both spontaneously and through like effort and practice, and effortless practice as well, some people have reported experiencing them through psychedelic states. So I wanted to hear your stance on that. How do you think that psychedelics fit into the spiritual journey, and what would you kind of advise somebody who's considering using them?
Oh, right. Well, I mean, later I did, have had good experiences with magic mushrooms, for instance. Haven't really done anything much heavier than that. And this was well after the bulk of my heavy sort of meditation trainings. And and so it felt like, basically having a mirror held up. And by, kind of talking with other people about their experiences, I think I would have had a very different experience if I hadn't already sort of had sort of moved into these different parts of my nervous system through meditation practice. And so it felt like a mirror of maybe the deepest expression of my nervous system at the time that it was capable of. And so it was lovely. Mainly, I think psychedelics can be good door openers. They don't feel like they have a lot of bottom to them as far as producing stable experience or stable ongoing experience. I think they're wonderful door openers. I've always had a little bit of a bias, whether merited or unmerited, I'm not sure, toward things that are much more endemic and make sort of cooking your own chemicals without too much of an outer stimulus. But so that's kind of where I sit. Is it's wonderful to have the doors open, but I don't think doing too much DMT in heavy doses regularly is going to ultimately shift the psyche into sort of an ongoing wholeness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, yeah. And also another question, again, as a follow-up to what you said previously, kind of commenting on the world and the all the upheaval that is happening currently in so many ways, like health-wise, politically. How do you see the way that we stand currently? It seems that we're in a very kind of precarious position where it's a small minority of people have enough power to basically take everybody down with them. And
Right.
Also, there's so many things that are currently holding us back from devoting ourselves to spiritual practice and to spiritual growth. How do you see things as they are now globally?
Well, of course, hate to always answer with these caveats, but it depends on what country we're talking about. There are certain trends, say in the United States, where I'm originally from, that are quite similar to the countries of Western Europe, although there's a lot of differences there. But generally, there's a lot of chickens that are coming home to roost. So I'll talk about the United States, for instance, because that's the country I know the best. We have certain things that are structural and systemic, economically and socially, and often, those things are pretty tied, that, that people have not necessarily been ultimately feeling the effects of for some time. And so it's inevitable. So, to be specific, capitalism, for instance, that system has certain structural flaws to it. I'll call them flaws. You can say they're great. Funneling the money up into very few hands. That's structural. I don't think it's necessarily structural to human nature. I think there's some of that there, but I think it's also to the design of the system. That you have major shareholders of companies that are the ones who have most of the votes, and that there's a tendency for the people who have most of the votes to kind of steer things in the direction that is beneficial for them, and isn't necessarily beneficial for the workers or for the minor shareholders or for a great many other people. And a lot of that is unconscious. There's a lot of people who, I don't think that there's that many cruel individuals hatching nefarious schemes. I think it tends to be much more a case of, a lot of cock-ups happening all at the same time and sort of structurally. And, a lot of this can be boiled down to separation, to the experience of so many of us having the experience of being a little billiard ball, basically, with a bunch of other little billiard balls around them whacking into each other. Certain systems and structures of government arise out of that, I think are kind of inevitable out of that. And so, those chickens are coming home to roost as well. You know, those consequences are coming back. If we look at how we treat the environment and the natural world, for instance, a lot of our technologies of extraction have now been taken to way beyond what people in the 18th century thought. You know, these people maybe innocently thought, oh, the world is so massive and we are so few and we can just kind of do what we're doing and it's great. You know, and so we've kind of reached a limit where some of us have now realized, we can't just do that. We can't just, you know, be like ostriches and sort of keep extracting from this world all the stuff. You know, like the United States, 4%. The United States is 4% of the population of the world and uses 25% of the resources. You know, that can't go on forever without consequences. So that's not even spiritual. That's just, you know, physical. And so people just have, you know, are, I think, maybe in a very difficult birthing of a different world that is inevitable, that has to be. And we get to make the choice of whether we're going to do that from sort of the reptile brain and sort of become tribal, and, you know, like what happened in the 1930s and what's happening again in Europe and the United States. There's this, you know, I think this tribal instinct that tends to end up with a sort of a fascist system, maybe with an authoritarian father figure who people can feel safe with, our little limbic system can feel safe with, or we have to sort of, you know, grow up and act and, you know, create systems which are, I think, a lot more holistic, you know, that take into account interdependency instead of just, you know, tribalism.
Exactly.
And that's more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, the US isn't my country, but for example, I would be following the kind of, you know, it's all about the elections now, and then I would, let's say, watch a rally by a politician, and it's literally people pitting each other against other people, and it just doesn't seem good in any way. And it seems like the rift between, you know, whatever, like left and right, Republican and Democratic, is just becoming larger and larger, and it's no longer, it almost becomes like a matter of survival to not let the other person, you know, express themselves, and it's just becoming very vicious, it seems to me, and it doesn't seem like it's a healthy process.
Well, you know, in the United States, we can also look back to, say, Republican Rome, and you had two groups, called the optimates and the populares. You know, and you know, actually, in a certain sense, these two groups in a lot of countries tend to, you know, have political parties coalesce around them. You know, to one extent or the other, there's a sense, okay, we need to, you know, let's have a country for the elite few, you know, in which then everybody else can sort of be given a sort of place, or we can have a country that's sort of underpinned by having power. Economic and political be much more distributed amongst many more hands. And so there, you know, this is an oversimplification in many ways, but there's something to that. There's a basic tension to that. And, you know, I tend to think that, and I get in trouble here because, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, spiritual growth is necessarily going to make a person less part of the optimate or conservative camp, is the way it tends to be, and more part of the populares. But at the same time, I tend to think so, to be perfectly honest, that I think that the more we grow and the less we're sort of controlled by the fear mechanisms of the limbic system of moving our lives, that, you know, that the more we have a tendency of kind of trusting and saying, okay, why don't we distribute this power a little bit more? Why don't we, instead of say restricting voting to kind of like a small elite educated class, which a lot of people think, because, you know, actually a lot of people are very bad voters. I will say that there are people who are shit at voting, and you know, and so you want to have, say, intelligent voters, for instance, and you either do that by restricting or by investing in the education of everybody. You know, these are two choices, and I tend to think that it's much better to instead educate everybody and put the effort and the money into restructuring society so that more people are able to bloom to their fullest extent, and not just put society in the hands of a very few people who might be very cultivated, and everybody else who is less cultivated and has to be controlled by this class. So that's a question that I think is that underlying decision of how to do that framing, I think is under a lot of is moving behind the scenes, under the surface in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, not to take things back home, just because I'm running slightly over time, the time I told you. But one final question is, with all this, with spiritual progress and spiritual growth, there is sometimes a danger that we become detached from the outer circumstances of our world. What is your advice or comments on achieving both inner awakening and outer awakening, and kind of taking this light that is born within us and spreading it out and helping the physical world and the world of forms, as they would say? What's your advice on that?
Well, I think it's fairly natural for there to be periods of retreat, and I think oftentimes, and it's going to look different for every people, they're necessary. So there's that wonderful, Zen, I suppose, saying, I don't know actually which tradition it comes from, that first there's a mountain, then there's no mountain, and then there's a mountain again. And we do have to, that first mountain is made up of a lot of bullshit, a lot of our own bullshit and our projections about things. And it's, we have to erase a lot of that. And we have to have a no mountain phase in which we let go, and that's like a retreat. That's a movement inward. But of course, it's not the complete thing, because the mountain, we have to find the final mountain, and that's a coming back into things and seeing, the mountain, and seeing the world, and seeing, other people without all of our projections onto them. And I think this basic pattern kind of continues on as we grow. I think that there's a natural sort of, periods of retreat and pulling back, and then needed periods of letting the love move through us, because most of us aren't meant to just go to the North Pole and sit in an isolated ice cave. That's not most of our dharmas, and most of us are meant to be out in the world, working different jobs, creating different art, being kind, raising families, writing books, whatever the hell, going fishing, I don't know. These are important, and these are the parts that we're born to play. And so we're, just like, Krishna and Arjuna and the Bhagavad Gita, I mean, the basic core of that is, be in the world but not of it. But you can't just be not of it. You have to be open enough to let the universe and let your dharma rush through you. You have to dance. We all have dances to dance and songs to sing, and so that's just as important. And so don't go around being disembodied. I mean, you might have that period for a while, but there are things that are meant to move through us, and that's part of development as well. As okay, fine, find the silence. But if you're really honest and you're really in the silence, not some mental projection of it where you're trying to control. If you're really there, you're not controlling. You're not editing. And then there's a moment in which we can either seize up because of some fear that's there, or we can let go and let whatever's trying to move through us. And that's a growth point. We might not always see it. Sometimes we do see it. Sometimes we do catch it. And so that allowance of the dance to come through us, that is just as important as the decision to pull back from our bullshit. Because that movement of love is going to expand our capacity to actually sit in the silence. That movement of love is going to also transform our bodies and transform our psyche, and all these things which in some ways are kind of like the lens or the container which unbound spirit is using to live through us. And so that just goes on and on and on. So essentially your message is, wherever somebody is on the path, trust in the process and know that the path is cyclical, not linear, and let whatever process is taking place take place.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could boil it down to that, you know, or say be full-hearted in what you're doing. You know,
Be sincere,
be
right?
fully in it. Be sincere. Yeah, exactly. Be honest, be sincere, be earnest, be full-hearted with whatever it is, and that's very helpful. I mean, again, it's also very helpful to have good mirrors too in people, in other people, both enlightened and just people who you allow to, you know, take you down a peg or two. You know, it doesn't have to be some, you know, just all enlightened masters. You're going to have God giving you directions from all sorts of people. And if you're open to that, you know, you're going to get the guidance that you need without fail. And so, you know, that's helpful too. I mean, I was lucky because I got to be in a monastic environment in which you had both peers sort of around the same level of awareness, and also people who've been along the path for longer. And, you know, they were, you know, able to sort of say, hey, you know, why are you stuffing that? You know, there seems to be something that you want to say. And, you know, maybe if I didn't have that, I could have gone a whole lot longer without actually having this thing come through, because, you know, I was, you know, stuck in it was getting stuck by some sort of old pattern, you know, of self-editing or fear, you know, ultimately.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I relate to that. I've discovered that God, or whatever you wish to call it, has guided me in all kinds of manners. It could literally be by speaking with a teacher whom I kind of expect guidance from, or it could be just a random stranger. It could be a video game, literally. It is just everywhere. This kind of guidance, which is the most subtle thing you can imagine.
Yeah.